storytelling can actually affect the brain. The emotions that we can conjure up with a good narrative, releases certain endorphins and adrenaline, dopamine into our brains that helps facts stick.
You can't look at Malala and say, I see hope in her. Yeah. Hope is an interpretation that you construct about her possibility that by definition doesn't exist yet.
The most powerful institution when it comes to bringing about shifts in our culture, it would be media.
It's a big responsibility to think about what these images that we're putting into these shows are.
Are you going to tell a story about coping in a post-COVID world?
The choices that we're going to be making going forward in terms of content in many ways will have to be impacted by who we are, what's happened to us, what stories we want to tell, and how we want to talk about it with kids.
Hi, welcome. We are so excited to have this incredible panel, leaders in documentary filmmaking, social impact, and in academia, speaking about the movie, the documentary Social Dilemma, and how media and social media impact young people. I'm Yalda Uhls. I am the founding director of the Center for Scholars and Storytellers. We're based in the psychology department at UCLA. And our mission is to bridge the gap between scholars and storytellers to support positive youth development. I am really pleased to first introduce Dr. Candice Odgers. She's a professor of psychological science and informatics at the University of California Irvine, and she's also an expert on adolescent mental health and child development in the digital age. Welcome, Candice.
Hi, Yalda. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I am next pleased to introduce Jeff Orlowski. He is the director, producer, and cinematographer of the award-winning films Chasing Coral and Chasing Ice. He founded Exposure Labs, an incredible social impact organization. It's a production company dedicated to impact through film. His latest film, The Social Dilemma, had its world premiere at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival and was a top 10 movie on Netflix for a very, very long time. Welcome, Jeff.
Yes, thank you so much, Yalda.
And last but not least, we have Larissa Rhodes. She's a filmmaker and the head of creative development at Exposure Labs, where she develops projects that are environmentally and socially minded. Recently, she produced the Sundance, Peabody, and Emmy Award winning film, Chasing Coral, and she previously worked on the Emmy Award winning documentary, Chasing Ice. The Social Dilemma is her latest producing project. Welcome, Larissa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm really, really excited to put together this all-star panel. And I also want to thank Jenna Signorelli and Annie Myers, who are behind the scenes from the center, for helping put this all together. So let's just kick it off. I'm going to start with Jeff and Larissa. And either of you can answer. I hope you'll play off of each other. What did you hope would be the social impact of this movie? And who is the primary audience? Was it clearly resonated with young people, I'm assuming, maybe all ages. You may know what ages, Netflix may have told you. But were you also hoping to influence policy people? What were you hoping?
Yeah, Larissa, I'm happy to jump in and then pass it over to you if that works. I kind of joke sometimes that I made this movie hoping that my mom would watch it. And that was just like an interesting filter and rubric for me. And I look at that as a translation around how do you make something accessible to broad audiences and to the general public? I think when we first started working on this, it was very easy for us to fall into like the tech bubble and talking deep around algorithms and machine learning and complicated concepts that I think Larissa and I and our whole team had to wrap our head around. But we knew that if we made something just for the tech ML AI crowd, it would not have gone wide, and it would not have hit the conversation and elevated the conversation to the scale that we thought we needed to. So I think one of the challenges that we faced was, how do we make these complicated concepts as accessible to parents, to legislators, to students. And one of the things that I feel most proud about is that we've seen really, really strong response from all of those different groups. We've had countless students and teachers and youth groups reach out to us about the film. Likewise, we've had countless politicians reach out to us about the film. And so, I mean, it's sort of a cop-out answer to say we were trying to make it for everybody, but I think genuinely that was one of the thoughts in mind. We envisioned this as, what's the inconvenient truth for technology in 2020? And how do we bring something to the table that can really sort of like lay out a landscape for lots of different people to engage with?
Yeah, I would also add too that when we were learning about the issue, we started to recognize that this was an underlying, like a foundational issue that was really affecting a lot of other issues that we cared about. Name the issue that you care about when you perform, a Google search, for example. The results that you get back aren't necessarily what you would consider to be a fact. So I think for us, it was really trying to understand how embedded are these issues in the design. And when you think about the design, that design affects everybody. And the intentions behind the design, I think, were what was most interesting and illuminating for us to expose, and recognizing that those intentions affect all the people that use this technology around the world.
Great. Well, yeah, that was a little bit of a, it was for everybody. But I do think, ultimately, and that's what we believe in the center, that shaping media for mass audiences is a really great way to have impact and
yeah, absolutely,
in a meaningful way. And then ultimately, if you get the mass audience, hopefully policy members and others that need to hear about it will. So on the website, you call out 3 dilemmas, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. One is mental health, one is democracy, and the last is discrimination. Candice, Dr. Odgers, has extensively studied and reviewed the issues around mental health, social media, and young people. And she really is one of the foremost experts. So Candice, I'd love you to talk a little bit around what the research says about whether social media causes, and you guys notice I'm saying causes, mental health issues, and I know what you'll probably say, but also where what do we know, what do we not know, what do we still need to study?
Yeah, thanks, Yalda. And thanks for this great film. I'm really happy that the conversation has started because we've been working with kids to direct the conversation to understand these settings where they now spend, the majority of their day, even before COVID hit, and to think about that seriously in terms of what are the opportunities and risks. We've been following young people for a long time. So we work mostly with adolescents, and we actually follow them on their mobile devices around their schools and neighborhoods and try and understand kind of their experiences in daily life and how the technology they're using impacts them, things like sleep and mental health. And one of the most surprising things we've found, and that we found in reviewing the results of others, is that the links are really small. They're really tiny in terms of mental health connections. They're most likely not there. And when they are there, they're kind of in small directions in positive and negative ways, but there's a very strong negative around this idea that social media causes mental health problems in kids. And so that's been the space we've been trying to reconcile, is why this belief is, kind of so strong among adults and among teens themselves, this narrative, whereas the evidence, and maybe it's the case that the evidence isn't strong enough, but it doesn't seem to support that narrative. So it's in that gap of kind of what's happening in this space.
Well, one thing, though, I do think there is fairly strong evidence is there is a pretty strong, well, we know that sleep is critical for mental health and physical health, and there is a fair amount of evidence around that, correct? And there is evidence, what is the evidence around using media and sleep? And if that, maybe that's the underlying cause, or maybe there are other underlying causes that maybe fuel this narrative?
Yeah, and so people are concerned that kids are up late at night and kind of losing sleep over social media, and there's some evidence to support that. And again, what you tend to find now is that fear might be overblown. And I know I always sound, whenever I talk to an audience, they say, "Oh, this is the pro technology researcher," but I'm not. I'm pro kids and I'm pro evidence. So I just go in and try and look at why the narratives are mismatched with it. I think the place where what really resonated with the social dilemma is that we've been saying, people are screaming about mental health and social media and causing mental health, and that's really not what we should be taking up the energy in the room. But the other issues that you guys focused on in that documentary, which was kind of optimizing algorithms for profit and time on screen, of not taking seriously like how these settings are impacting youth, or that youth are the main people on many of these platforms, those and equity issues around kind of how opportunities are structured. Yeah, those are the big the big kind of things. Whereas the mental health issues, the evidence doesn't seem to align quite as strongly.
Yeah, great. I'm going to, definitely get to democracy and discrimination, which are really important issues that the film talks about and, other people have been talking about. How has COVID impacted all of your thinking around this? I mean, I know Jeff and Larissa, when you filmed this, we were in person, people were in person, everybody, you filmed it. And then all of a sudden the world changed and we are all, have to use technology to communicate. How's it changed your thinking, Jeff and Larissa, and you too, Candice?
Yeah.
Do you want to, I'm happy to start, or
go ahead.
Where should we go?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'd love to offline Candice on seeing the latest research and everything that you've been exploring. So would love to circle back on that. I think a couple thoughts on the COVID front. I just at a personal level, when I was on social media, I spent a lot of time doom scrolling. That was kind of like my pastime of choice, I think. And I've stopped using all social media in the making of this film, and just kind of felt my own personal shift and experience that kind of migrated me away from just like the endless negative content that I was seeing and was being algorithmically reinforced back to me. For me personally, to not have been on social media during COVID, I found, like, I think in my own experience, just a different mental state than I think a lot of my friends and peers were, as just the tumultuousness of last year just kind of was constantly being reflected back in different ways. So, I mean, it's interesting in that, like, because of COVID, we're spending so much more time on our devices and on social media. And yet personally, I think for me personally, at least, I found the greatest connection with my friends and family, not through those social media platforms. And Candice, to echo what you were saying earlier, this is not an anti-technology mindset for me. I love technology. We're using great tech right now to have this conversation. But this as a conversation through technology is very different in my mind than what an algorithmic feed is optimizing for and just trying to engage. Right? I think the fundamental thing that I keep coming back to is that the incentives for big social companies, the incentives for how they make money, are incentives that don't have the user's best interest at heart. Like, it's not trying to figure out how is a teenage kid going to, like, become the most fulfilled version of themselves. It is just what's going to get them to come back and keep looking on the platform. And I think the big thing is, like, the answer to that algorithmic question is different for all of us. The thing that will keep me coming back to my newsfeed of choice is different than the thing that works on each and every one of us here, and works on every individual in a different way. So for me, the COVID has, like, sort of amplified the dilemma even more, in that we're in a period of time where people are so hungry for human connection, and we go to these platforms thinking that we're going to get human connection, even though in my mind, as one of our interview subjects said, but it didn't work into the film, that these platforms offer connectivity and not real connection. And how do we really use technology to offer real human-to-human connection, as I think we are also craving and desirous of?
I would also add, I'm curious, Candice, the latest research as well. I know Yalda was very careful to use the word cause. Causation, we all know, is different than correlation. And I think one of the subjects also said, and this didn't make it into the film, but I think, or maybe it is in the film, Jeff, that we're running one of the largest psychological experiments using social media on humanity without a control group. And that, I think, is the question mark and is the concern. And I think there's a need for more science and more data for us to better understand how this technology is affecting us. So, yeah, very eager to learn more about that. And I am with Jeff. I stopped using social media during the making of this film, and find that my real connections with my family, friends, have not suffered at all, and if anything, have improved. So that has been mine, but recognize that it's not for everyone, especially during this COVID time.
Yes, I think so my answer will be more directed at children and kind of adolescents through the pandemic. And for them, many of them have gravitated to those platforms, some of them at younger ages than their parents would have been prepared to let them go there because they were missing that social connection. And whether that's gaming and having a Discord channel or, being on FaceTime and just chatting, but it really is, I think it's different than the kind of doom scrolling that we do as adults, and that young people have found these creative ways to extract some of the things that they've been missing and needed. But it's also, as both of you have mentioned, just highlighted how much that human connection is missing. And it's also difficult, we talk about the online world, but so much of what we do in the online world is connect and strengthen relationships that we have offline. And so when those get shut down, it becomes kind of a different animal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. I always, when I give parent talks and have in the past, I always quote this focus group kid who said, adults think I'm addicted to technology. I'm not addicted to technology. I'm addicted to my friends, which is, I think, the underlying drive for teens. And it's developmentally really important for them to connect with other teens. So if there's not a way, obviously face-to-face is, I believe, the best way to connect, to learn. But if it's not available, this is certainly a great way for them to connect. And I've been asked lately in parent talks and also in the press, do you think what's going to happen when COVID is done? Are they going to, now that they've all, like, the gate was open, they've all been on this 24/7, what's going to happen? I said, I think they're not going to care. Like, they're going to want to be in person. They're going to throw these devices away and rush to be with each other because that's what they really want. That's what we crave.
If I can add to that, Yalda,
Absolutely.
And that's why I'm personal. I use FaceTime all the time. I use Signal all the time, text messaging all the time. The ability to connect with friends and family, as you're pointing to, is really, really valuable. I think where I start to, I want to push on where is the technology best serving us or not, is when we talk about the Snapchats and the Instagrams and the TikToks and the Facebooks and Twitters, where they have a different incentive structure in mind. And the algorithmically machine learning driven optimization engines that are trying to figure out how do we get you to keep coming back. FaceTime isn't pinging me on an hourly basis to tell me to talk to my grandmother, right? Like I engage with my grandmother on a regular basis, but it's not like the algorithm is trying to like find every possible nodal connection. And I think that's where the perspectives that I've gathered in the making of the film is really trying to align on where are the incentives for the public or not. There is this line that we use in the film: if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And that is definitely a massive simplification of the story here. But I do find that there's something valuable in just using that as a pressure tester. You pay for your phone, you pay for text messaging, you pay for FaceTime, like that's through that Apple software. You're paying for a Zoom account if you're engaging via Zoom. But where are the platforms that are worth hundreds of billions of dollars, where we don't pay them with our money, but there's some other mechanism of extraction that's happening there? And so that's where I just want to point people's attention to think critically about, like, when are they designed really for our best interest or not?
Yeah, and I don't think you'll get any disagreement. I early on in my academic career, I pointed out that when there are commercial interests behind the way that people communicate, and particularly teens, that's when we need to think about it. So I'm going to go back to what Candice started thinking. So talking about and talk about democracy and discrimination. You, I know, Candice, have been interested in bias and machine learning algorithms in terms of what young people see and experience online. What do you know about this topic? And what do you think?
Yeah, so one of the reasons we've been trying to move the conversation away from kind of the fear on mental health is that there's these huge issues or huge differences in how children experience the online world and how the online world sees them, right? So if we just take the example, we look across kids who are growing up in low-income houses or higher income houses, and the kids in low-income houses, we know they're online between 1.5 or 2 hours more per day. Their viewing looks very different. They're actually fed a different set of search parameters or videos based not only on kind of their input, but also the input of other devices connected to them, maybe their zip code. And, thinking about what we want kind of children to see, especially from an early age in terms of representation online. The algorithms, as you pointed out in the film, we could build those to optimize for something other than profit or time on screen. And this is a huge opportunity, and that just hasn't been looked at the way that we look at the other settings where children spend the majority of their time. The response has been, for social media companies in particular, to pretend they're not there, to say that you have to be 13 years of age. But in our studies, 60% of 10-year-olds have a social media account, 85% of 14. So we know that's not true. And so opening up that conversation and really highlighting the role that big tech has to play of kind of policing the playground and being a social safety net, especially right now.
Yeah. So I totally agree. So just to transition on, so we can get to questions, and we have questions from. I have a class called Digital Media and Human Development that I teach, and everybody watched The Social Dilemma, and many of my students sent in questions. Jeff and Larissa, before we get to the questions, what's next for you?
Well, I can jump into, and just to piggyback off of what Candice was saying, there's another film too called Coded Bias, which speaks to some of the algorithmic bias for viewers out there who want to continue to learn more about that. It is not just segregated to algorithms in the way that they appear on social media platforms, for example. It really does evolve into how our policing is done, how our government is set up, how our recidivism and our criminal justice system is conducted. So I encourage people to watch that. But on our end, we have been mainly focusing on the outreach for this film. We have a team that is really kind of focused on 3 main arms of the campaign, and maybe I'll pass it to Jeff to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Larissa. To this question, as Larissa was saying, we're really just focused on how do we leverage this movie and this conversation and just engage as much as we can. So the main work that we do falls into the arms of continuing public awareness and education, and then also engaging with youth and Gen Z in particular. And then lastly, equipping policymakers and trying to help give policymakers a sense of the perspectives that we've gathered, and pointing them to the experts in the field based on what the policymakers are most curious about. And so that's been a big commitment for our team, just keeping that conversation going.
Okay, well, it sounds like we have an opportunity, maybe all of us, to use the power of this film and to use the incredible research that Candice and other people have been doing to really focus on some of the discrimination and the bias and the just the fundamental issues that when you have. And I always think about Jaron Lanier, who is that how you say his name? Lanier.
Lenny, yeah.
He lives in Berkeley, where I grew up. But how he says, and I think people have said this, when you have 2 people communicating and then you have a whole team of engineers, maybe Tristan said it, listening to these 2 people communicating, and that's different. So it's different than just the telephone, and that's the issue for me, for sure, that I think does need to be resolved, in addition to, not the polarization that I think the internet creates, but clearly it has allowed very extreme views to use these platforms to incite violence and other things. But that's an issue for another day. So I am going to start asking some of the questions, and I will start with one for Dr. Odgers, and then we'll go to Jeff and Larissa. So Candice, this is from Diana. If we could have child psychologists make or manage social media, how much of a difference would that make for young users? And I can answer that question. My answer would be they probably wouldn't use it because it would be really boring.
Exactly.
Go ahead, Candice.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, you need to find that place where the magic happens. So psychologists have a lot of evidence, a lot of interventions of what works, and it's boring to kids and they don't do it. And, the gamification, in the online world, it draws them in, and they love it. And so where do we go? Well, the best place is partnerships, right? Where you can kind of embed some of this, not sneak it in. And you've been doing this for a long time in traditional children's media, Yalda, with learning.
I do say smuggle it in.
But there's also opportunities. So I'll take, adolescent mental health, for example. We know that like 80% of young people go online to seek out information and help for mental health problems. Can't we provide services, meet them where they are, provide it in a way that, they want to hear it, or that is like engaging to them, bring them in as experts. I mean, there are ways to do this. We haven't mobilized in a way to make these spaces really creative and useful for kids. And that requires some partnerships, and neither tech companies or psychologists going it alone.
Yeah, and I actually think that with respect to mental health, I mean, there have been studies, for example, that Vicky Rideout did a study where she studied people nationwide, teens, and she actually I looked at depressed populations of teens, and most of them actually said that they needed the internet and they used it for connecting with others. They felt better after using it. It was self-report, but these vulnerable teens actually needed and looked up information. And why can't we put pressure on places like Snapchat and Instagram and all these other places to really work with researchers to help use, and TikTok, they're creating all this content to actually, for those vulnerable teens, surface resources that have been proven to be effective. What do you think that's possible, Jeff or Larissa?
I'm not sure. I feel like it's getting a little beyond my wheelhouse there, but I don't know, Larissa, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky because you recognize, as Jeff pointed out earlier, that the fundamental business model is just not really aligned with humanity's best interests. And so getting the companies to offer their data to researchers, or making it available, making your data portable to other platforms, those are things that I think are being asked of these platforms. And I think there's a real question as to whether or not they're willing to open up and make things more accessible to researchers for those purposes. And I think, to your point, it feels like there have been so many cases or instances where people don't necessarily know or understand their own usage or repercussions of that usage. And so I think having more data, having more visibility or transparency into how these platforms are working and to what purpose, I think could only help rather than hurt.
Yeah, that is where shame and places where organizations that call out that these companies can do better might actually be successful. And that's where I'm really grateful for for the work that you guys are doing in terms of trying to call these people out. Here's a question for Jeff and Larissa from Jen. What challenges did you face promoting a documentary about the potential harm of social media in an age when promotion is done almost entirely digitally?
That's a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Quite honestly, I didn't feel any real challenges there, in that we were getting so much word of mouth and buzz on the film. I've stopped using social media. The film does have a social media presence, really for educational purposes, but not for promotional purposes. That's not the main goal of the Social Dilemma's presence online. But the film was just getting so much natural, organic buzz that people were promoting and people were talking about it on social, but the conversations were happening in real life. And I think that's the biggest thing that we were seeing, is that people were talking about it with their families and taking it home, and friends were talking about it with each other. And so it became like old school viral, like real human to human conversation around the themes and the issue. And so, I mean, it hit a zeitgeist with the launch of the film, and that's something I think we were really, really thrilled about.
Yeah, I would also add too that I think we also recognize that while Jeff and I individually are not on social media, the majority of a lot of other people. I shouldn't say the rest of the world, but a lot of other people are. And so I think we wanted to bring the conversation to where they were. But I think we also were hoping to call out some of the usage or design techniques that are trying to trick, trap, bring us back in so that people can become more aware of those things. So it was usage, but intentional and perhaps with some design.
Got it. Okay, Candice, another question from Isha, which kind of we touched on, and, what would you say is the responsibility of child development experts in big tech companies like the one mentioned in the documentary? What's their responsibility, their moral responsibility?
Yeah,
not
so
financial.
That's a good question. And I think, though, that's where we're all trying to figure out where is the best lever, because we know, for adults to turn off their social media is one thing. For young people to do it, it can be disastrous in terms of friendship groups. I mean, this is where young people are living. And so trying to shut off those devices now might be a lost cause. So how do we make the spaces that they're in healthier, right? How do we make them, align with what we want to see happen, or be regulated in the ways that we traditionally could have done with kind of advertising or children's media? And this is a whole new ball game. And for the issues that you identified in terms of the business model, this is not going to be an easy task. I think there is a moral responsibility. I think there's an ethical imperative. I think this is especially true as we think internationally in terms of low and middle income countries, of the potential benefits of information and education and all of the good that can be done and how those gaps can be closed. But what we see with the introduction of new technologies is that the rich get richer. And that is especially true in big tech, but that is also true for children using it. So children who are growing up in higher income households have parents that are tailoring and optimizing and protecting and doing these types of things that kind of optimizes tech for their child in a way that all children are not having access to. It's that mediation of technology to bring out the good and minimize the harm that all children do not have equal access to. So if there was a role for big tech to come in and develop algorithms that could help with that thorny issue, then I would say that would be a top priority.
And we are starting to see more and more hardware manufacturers making devices where kids can still send text messages and call your parents, and in an emergency you're fine, and you can still message your friends, but they don't have the addictive technologies or the platforms of the capabilities for news and social media in that same way. So I think we might see this new era of technology that really is trying to thread the needle for what works for kids. How do you get the benefits without the consequences?
What do you guys think about this idea? Oh, never mind. Here's a question. Okay, and this is for Jeff and Larissa. What measures can be taken by content creators in the entertainment industry to promote positive youth interaction on social media? And I'll actually share this is an idea I had. I was actually approached to
kick it off, please. Yeah.
Okay, it may be really stupid, and I'm sure people have thought about it before, but everybody always talks about, the internet's like driving a car. What's the right metaphor? So on and so forth. And so what about some kind of driver's license which would be some kind of education you have to take? And this would be at the internet access. This would be actually before you even get access to the internet, around social norms and behaviors for adults too, not just kids, for everybody.
I think you're tapping into a really big question, and I think the heart of your question, or the heart of your thought there, is that there is a gap in responsibility in the system, and there's a gap on the content creator side and who's putting stuff onto the internet, and there's a gap on the consumption side and how are we ingesting this information that we're seeing. Similar to your driver's license notion, I've heard people talk about applying FCC guidelines around content creation to internet content creators. So if you wanted to broadcast to 1,000 people on a television station or a radio program, you need to get a license from the FCC to uphold certain standards for what you're going to broadcast out to thousands or tens of thousands or millions of people. And yet you can broadcast on the internet with no license, no fact checking, no review. You can say anything regardless of truth, and millions of people can see it with huge consequences that might come from it with, oh, wait, that was First Amendment free speech. I was allowed to say that falsehood, right? There's a huge gap in the system in how it exists right now. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for education, but a need for responsibility on both sides of that equation of who's making what type of content and how it's being released, and then how people are interpreting and ingesting that content as well. So I'll think about a driver's license more, but I love that concept.
I love
an internet driver's license.
I really do, and I think that what's so interesting about that is it allows for us to create a criteria in which we feel comfortable letting our kids or letting ourselves participate in an internet online world. And I think the danger is that then we don't see that responsibility or that burden has then fallen on the user. Whereas just like with cigarettes, it was saying, "Oh, good luck quitting, that's on you," as opposed to saying, "Actually, you've made this technology, you've designed it in a way that is not good for humans, and humans are actually addicted to it." Separate in this case, not addicted to social media, but I think that burden of wanting to, as Jeff said, placing the ethical kind of blame on the individual as opposed to saying, actually, there's a responsibility for these tech companies to design it differently.
Well, I mean, I actually thought of this because I forgot who, Tim Berners-Lee said, the internet is a right. I think a lot of people are saying that, everybody. And I do believe at this point, it probably is true. I mean, everyone should have access to it. We need it to get a vaccine. We need it for everything. Yet at the same time, I've heard that the cigarette metaphor is not the same because that is, I think it's because I forgot why it was, but that the driving is a better one metaphor because you actually can learn about it and you can get information about it, and then you're permitted into using it. So anyway, Candice, I'd love to know what you think about that idea.
Yeah,
and then also about responsibility.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the on-ramp to the online world and independence and social media all happens in this crazy spot in human development, which is pre-adolescence. And so, if I were to pick, I agree that all people should probably, have some sort of basic kind of digital literacy or option to do that. But I think we do have like this specific window where kids are first exploring online by themselves, right? Creating their own accounts, spending more independent time online in that early adolescent window where we could think about some kind of targeted, whether that's around digital literacy, whether it's around offering supports, whether it's around pressuring social media companies, to acknowledge the fact that they're there and that their algorithms, when I've had conversations in kind of the big tech space, they'll say, well, we have, YouTube Kids. Well, yeah, you do, but all the kids are on YouTube. Or you have Messenger. Well, yeah, you do, but you just have to accept that they're all there. And then the algorithms you build to screen out negative content has to go to the floor of where your audience lives, right? In terms of risk. And so I think, thinking about kind of where is the space and there where people are most at risk. And I think, for this next generation, it's that window as they go into adolescence.
Yeah, and Common Sense Media, I think, has a digital citizenship curricula, which is helpful for them to get a sort of lay of the land and know what's out there and know what they should be aware of and not aware of. So I think that's a great example.
But I do think that does put the onus on teachers and parents, and we're all so busy, and so that's what I was sort of trying to think about. If the internet is a right, if you actually are given it, then when you sign up for your internet or your AT&T phone or whatever you do, is there some kind of onboarding for everybody? This is what Anya Kamenet said. The science behind the internet and it being incredibly harmful is not the same as the cigarette science. So, which is what Dr. Odgers is saying here. It's so you can't. It's not exactly the same. So I think the driving is the better metaphor.
Another example that we've used in the past is the plastic pollution issue. which is just so pervasive. And the solutions that are always given is like, recycle your plastic, or make sure you go to the grocery store and reuse your bags. And it's putting all the onus on the individual, as opposed to saying, wait, we need to shut off the plastic, single-use plastic from the source. We need to stop using oil to create the plastic. So I think it is more of just, regardless of what analogy you use, I think it's acknowledging like individuals can play a role and they need to play a role. And also we have to look and address this much larger burden that's caused by these companies and corporations that have an enormous power.
If I may continue there, like throwing another analogy in there, the comparison that I normally think about is a climate change analogy, which in the fossil fuel industry has a business model that is extremely profitable, yet consequential for society in different ways. And when you look at the consequences of fossil fuels, they showed up in society in countless different ways, whether we're talking about melting glaciers or ocean acidification or bleaching or plastics, or like there are all of these different things that came from this one business model that had this extract at all costs mindset. For me, the frame here is less a matter of big tech overall, or technology, or screens, or digital devices, or time online. Those are not the big concerns in my mind. The big concern in my mind is big social. And from my perspective, it is Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and I put Google in there as well. But all of these platforms that have this time against eyeballs business model, where our time and attention is being sold for advertising. TikTok fits that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so let me add one more thought there, Yalda, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But within that same frame, this extractive business model, it has different impacts on teenagers than it has on adults versus politically engaged people. The algorithms are looking for different ways to engage each and every one of us, right? And so the teen mental health slice of the conversation, I look at that as like a slice of this, like, well, how are we getting rampant misinformation and polarization, and a political polarization leading to things like January 6th that's happening in countless countries at the same time. Like for me, in exploring it in this fashion, and obviously there's still a need, as we're all saying, there's need for more and more research here. But political polarization is sort of the guaranteed outcome of personalized individual news feeds, where anything can come in, everybody sees anything, whatever resonates, whatever sticks to your brain is what you're going to get shown more and more often. And what happens, I've been using this Galapagos analogy. It's as if we're all on our own individual Galapagos islands. And the more you engage with the feed, the faster evolution happens to you. And my Galapagos Islands are going to drift this way, and somebody else's, they're in a different world, and their island might be drifting in a different direction. And that's how speciation happens, right? That is like our ideas are becoming no longer compatible. So for me, the biggest concern that I have is the polarization of our ideas in society as a whole, whether we're talking about our country or any country on the planet. And that's the thing that has me the most worried, which goes back to like the incentives and the way these technologies are designed with ML algorithms.
I just want to ask a quick question. This is really fascinating. And one of the things that I've struggled with in thinking about kind of what is the effect of the digital world on young people's mental health, and I think it applies to all the situation you're talking here, is it a mirror, right? Is it reflecting back what we see, these deeply embedded inequalities, divisiveness? Maybe it's amplifying, maybe it's kind of being used as a helpful tool in some places, but how much of this is a story we tell about a cause, which is really underlying structural inequalities and divisiveness that have
and capitalism,
right? And I mean, it's a model. Social media might not be
money at all, because what I was going to say is television, radio, all of these have advertising. All of these older medias, you can't sort of disengage and say it's just this. Even gaming, and you were, YouTube and TikTok and or Twitch and and gaming. So, anyway.
But Yalda, if we tune to channel whatever and we see the commercial on TV or the billboard,
there's regulation.
Not only is there regulation, not only is it going through filters and human curation, but there's also a shared story. Like we all see the same billboard, we see the same ad in the newspaper. That's what's really different with the digital distribution platforms, in that like I get my own personal filtered universe and it gets reinforced, and I get my own my decade plus of compound interest of like affirmation bias, and I'm forgetting all the biases that factor in, but
confirmation bias.
but there's confirmation bias, but there's a separate one. There's
fundamental
persistence.
attribution error. No, I'll just throw in lots of biases.
Exactly, but when you see it, when you see the same thing or similar things over and over and over and over, there's a reinforcement that happens. So even if it's a falsehood, you think it's true because you've seen it a dozen times, and that is a big part of the political polarization part of it. Candice, to your point, just one more point on the mirroring. I think that's the response that all the social media companies like to say, like, we're just holding up a mirror to society, and there's racism in society, and so that gets exacerbated. There's et cetera, et cetera. One of our subjects references it not as a mirror, but as a funhouse mirror that is distorting truth, that's distorting reality, that's distorting what is being rewarded based on these systems of how the machine learning algorithms optimize, right? It's like, if we're all attracted to see the car accident on the side of the road, the machine learning algorithms are saying, oh, car accidents are great. Let's have more car accidents. Let's put car accidents everywhere. So now we live in a world where car accidents are all we see every time we're going anywhere. And that's not accurately representative of our society. So I think it's really tricky if we're building algorithms based on time and attention with no human. It's just like whatever works. That is not bringing out, it's certainly not bringing out the best in society. And if it's then optimizing for bringing out like the things that we're most vulnerable to, it tends down that own path.
I actually do agree with the algorithm conversation in a lot of ways. And I think one of the reasons, if there is indeed, I know there is some evidence, we're not really sure why, that this generation is more anxious, possibly more lonely. Suicides have definitely been going up. I don't, and some people want to blame social media. I don't think the evidence is there at all. But I do think one thing is that news feeds, kids get news feeds at, through social media in a way they never did. And those news feeds do, for all of us, exaggerate and make us feel that the world is more violent or more, more school shootings. I mean, there's lots of things they're dealing with: climate change, school shoot, all these things. Yeah. But okay, here's my one other idea.
Just one thing to that, y'all. Like, the number of youth that we have come across that believe that the earth is flat has just been so befuddling to me, right? It is like, how are students going through high school science classes pushing back on their teachers and saying that the round earthers got to their teachers? And like, there's such
a lot of teachers that teach that in some places.
Well, that might be the case too, right? But
there's no requirement in most states for sex education to be based on fact.
Wow.
Science, the education system's another thing. Wait. Go ahead.
Yeah, and you're going to say
to Candice, to your point about the mirror, I also think there's a piece of it too, which is that the algorithms are choosing based on what it makes the most money, what they elevate or optimize for. So when we're looking at what's out there, what's on our newsfeed, and as you were saying, the doom scrolling and stuff is true, we're also seeing only what, quote, they decide that they want to show us. And I think that is not necessarily a mirror. It is more of the funhouse mirror. And I think one of our subjects says, like, freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom of reach. And I think that's really different. You used to be able to stand on your soapbox and say whatever you thought, whether it was a wild idea or a true idea. But that didn't mean that the entire world was listening and you had the whole platform available to you as an audience. So I think that's a really fundamental difference.
I'm glad I asked this question, because this is it's a good answer and it's a good conversation. And I believe it too, that it's like an interaction. It isn't a mirror. It's not static. One of the issues that always comes up though is like the attribution of the cause. It's so seductive. It's so powerful. Like, as a psychologist and a mom, I would want social media to be causing these things because I can turn it off. I can control it. The same thing happens with child obesity. People are blaming rising childhood obesity on kind of the digital world. Well, childhood obesity has been going up for decades, and sedentary behavior has been going down. And that's related to like how we design the urban environment and how do we supervise children. And if we just shut off the devices, they won't magically go out and like change their diet, reduce the, and so it's those kinds of things. I think when we're talking about the causal mirror versus kind of the causal driver of social media, that's absolutely the way the world probably works. But when we look for a solution, social media has become such a seductive and it's a good enemy, right? Like tech companies are a good thing to hate and to want to shut down, you know, kind of in the common discourse around this. But that's why I'm glad this larger conversation is being started about like how would we solve these things we actually care about, you know, discrimination, the fall of democracy.
Candice, if you could write legislation tomorrow, what would you want to put into effect that would help address the problems that you see?
Yeah, so it would be regulation of big tech for sure. It would be breaking up the monopolies. It would be having kind of mandatory. So part of the thing that's been frustrating, I think, is that the level of engagement from technology companies has been to invite kind of experts or youth in for a roundtable or kind of a public discussion, but it hasn't been tied in a way to the business model or the profit margin that really leads to any kind of changes in the design. And so, yeah, I mean, it has to, and you guys were exactly right. The business model has to change before we can get our idealistic notions of like what the world ought to look like, and the incentives are just not aligned.
Right.
Yeah. I have an idea for the algorithms. Another idea.
Yes.
Because I just constantly have ideas. Many of them bad, most of them. What if you train the algorithms to every third or fourth story put in the exact opposite view? So you had to, because we all do want, like, I don't want to like have a whole bunch of random stuff in my feed. You know, I do kind of want to have stuff that I'm interested in. But the problem is if that's all that I'm exposed to, right? So why don't we make the algorithms throw in a different point of view?
I've often thought that we should be able to control the dials on our algorithms. So how much friends versus family versus politics do I want? How much confirmation bias or not do I want? Do I want to just like say, no, filter out everything else, or push me, right? But if you had to,
but then that's relying on human nature to be perfect, and the mirror means there will be some people that will say, just give me one point of view.
Right, but then they know that they are getting a biased point of view, and maybe there's like a floor and a minimum standard around like you have to get so much like counter perspective to the articles that you're reading. But if you're consciously aware that you are getting a one-sided perspective, which is not the case with most people on social media, because they don't realize how filtered their own experiences are. That was honestly one of the most shocking things in the feedback from the film, is that people were constantly saying to us, I did not realize how filtered my experience was. I've often been recommending to people, if there's some family member that you disagree with politically, do a reality swap and look at their social media feed and show them your social media feed. And you'll have this experience of like, well, wait a second, like, how are you seeing all of this stuff?
That's a good idea. Like, we have relatives in Texas. So
And it gives the opportunity to reflect on what somebody else is ingesting, what they're consuming on a daily basis, what type of information are they seeing all the time, and allows
Jeff, don't tell my kids this, but I mess with their algorithms all the time, especially when they were little. Well, you know, I would go in and I would change, you know, Barbie to Dora, right? You know, I would just look, you know, and just get like, where are the female? But it's true.
That's awesome.
That's really funny.
Well, I was going to say, my daughter, after watching The Social Dilemma, okay, you know, I've been studying this for over, you know, almost 15 years, been talking to her, digital citizenship, worked for Common Sense, blah, blah, blah. She's like, oh my God, Mom, did you know that they're feeding us information?
Oh, Yalda.
No. So your film got through to
yes. Okay, great.
Which is why I was like, you know what? There's some really good stuff here.
Your first question, who do we make it for? We made it for your daughter.
Exactly. She's still on her phone though. Okay, we only have one more minute. So maybe instead of, maybe I'll do a for all. From D. This is actually a good one for all of you. What advice would you give to parents that are trying to manage social media with their children?
Great
one. Candice.
Larissa, you can start. You start, Larissa. I'm going to let Candice go last.
Okay. You know, I think especially given COVID and the digital world, it's a challenging decision and it's different for every family. So I always caveat any answer that everybody does have to, weigh their own personal life and what's needed. But as we were making the film, we were learning about some of the science behind it and recognizing it's not all there and a lot of it is correlational. But one of the things they did say very strongly that I've heard from a number of parents as well as experts in the field, that they recommend not having social media until after middle school, at least after 8th grade, if not after 16, recognizing that can be really difficult for parents to follow, given schools sometimes operate on social media. So I think part of the advice is also just being aware of how this technology works and how your kids are using it, because I think that's kind of the first big step. And then deciding, where are the factors where you can see people falling down a rabbit hole, where time usage is getting out of control, things like that. But for me, I really do think it is awareness and recognizing that every family is different.
Jeff?
I often recommend that families watch the film together, and then also have their kids' friends groups watch it together, have a shared conversation amongst all the families, all the parents, and all the kids within a friend circle. And the big question in my mind is, like, what do you want your relationship with technology to be? How can you get social connection, and how do you hang out, whether in person or via Signal or messaging apps, separate from the social media apps? But how do you get connection with your friends without the consequences of the manipulative algorithms? And one of the big things I would even pose, separate from any of the individual or collective health consequences of the technology, if you just look at it from the perspective of your time over the course of your life, right? I stopped using social media while making this film, and I felt tangibly when I needed my creative energy to make this movie, and when that was in conflict with this tension around wanting to scroll and being pulled back. And if you look at your screen time reports and see how much time you're spending on social media on a daily basis, and just do the math for like how much time a year over how many years you're going to live likely, and like how many years of your life are being fed into the system, and to give yourself the permission to claim that time back. And think about how you could use that time productively. How many thousands of books could you read? How many, great films could you watch? Like, how could you really make intentional use of that time, as opposed to just passively being a consumer? And that's basically what we are on these platforms. We're just passive consumers that have been monetized and turned into widgets. And that's where I would encourage both families, parents, and kids to really consider, like, what do you want out of many, many years of your life that would be spent on these platforms, but could be used really intentionally?
Candice?
So I'd probably give the advice, which is reflecting out here, which is don't count minutes and time. So parents often just see the kid and the screen, and they don't ask anything beyond that. They just say, how much time has my kid been in front of the screen, versus what are you doing online, right? In terms of, the social media part actually is a small fraction of what kids do online. They're watching videos, they're communicating with friends, they're gaming, they're doing kind of schoolwork. So sometimes it's not about the actual screen. And if parents can kind of move themselves past that focus on how much time their kids been online, and just ask questions, figure it out what they're, where they're spending their time. And if there are those aspects on the social media that you're not comfortable, that's a value conversation of your family values, and that's fine, right? You can hold those, but just kind of negotiate them and make sure that they can be shared and clearly articulated. So.
Well, thank you all. I'm just going to say I agree. I'm going to pull one thing from each of yours. Larissa, yes, absolutely. Every family is different, and each family has to make their own sort of value judgment. And Jeff, I definitely think thinking about being intentional and really sort of having a shared conversation between the adults and the children together is really important. And yeah, Candice, as you know, most of us researchers who study this say time is not as good of a metric as content, context, and the individual child, and also communication, how you communicate. So the 4 C's, that's a better thing to think about than, time, because 2 hours on Minecraft is a lot different than, 20 minutes on Call of Duty, just to give it a example. Although Call of Duty, I'm not dissing Call of Duty. Okay, well, I want to thank you all. This was an incredible conversation. It was very spirited. It was very respectful. It was very interesting. I feel like we came up with some good ideas. I want to put this in front of policy people. And I hope that we can continue to have these kind of conversations and try to leverage all of the work that we're doing to help young people thrive, and use technology in a way that helps them, be the best that they can be, and all of us be the best that we can be. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Yalda. Thanks for the great film, y'all.